The storm outside was fierce, but it was nothing compared to the tempest raging in Aisha's heart. Tonight, a single email would shatter everything she thought she knew. The rain hammered against the windows, streaking like tears down the glass as Aisha sat frozen in her chair. The email's subject line had been innocuous enough, an important truth. But the words inside were anything but. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as her eyes devoured the message, every line searing itself into her mind. Do you remember them, Aisha? The ones who stood smiling in the photos, pretending to be mentors, protectors? Look closely. They weren't just your teachers. They were liars. They were predators. She clicked on the attached photo, her breath catching in her throat. It was from an old school event, the spring talent show, she remembered now. She was there, beaming, her arm slung casually around the shoulders of Mr. Ellis Tuff, the English teacher who had once praised her poetry. To his left stood Mr. Porter, her history teacher, whose voice she used to find so calming. And then there were two more. Mrs. Hensley, the math teacher everyone trusted, and Coach Ryan, the loud but charismatic leader of the school's athletic program. Her smile in the photo was painfully naive, an innocence that felt like a cruel mockery now. The email continued. They stole something from you, and you didn't even realize it at the time. But you're not the only one. You have the power to expose them, but be prepared for the cost. Aisha's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. Her heart raced, her mind a swirling mix of disbelief and fury. How could she not have seen it? How could she have been so blind? She scrolled down further, desperate for clarity, for answers. But the email ended there, the screen fading into a mocking emptiness. Her gaze shifted back to the photo, her younger self staring back at her with a trusting smile. She couldn't tear her eyes away. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling as if it too was raging at the injustice of it all. Aisha pushed her chair back and stood abruptly, her reflection catching her in the darkened laptop screen. She barely recognized herself, her eyes hardened, her face set in grim determination. This wasn't just a message. This was a call to action, a fire ignited in the pit of her soul. But the email's final line echoed in her mind like a warning she couldn't ignore. Be prepared for the cost. Her voice was barely a whisper, trembling yet resolute. I'll make them pay, no matter what it takes. And with that, she slammed the laptop shut, leaving the photo and her innocence behind. You never really know who you are until someone breaks you. And for Aisha, that moment had come like a lightning strike in the dead of night. The next morning, Aisha sat at the kitchen table, her untouched mug of tea growing cold beside her. Across from her, her parents exchanged worried glances, their unease thick in the air. She had waited all night for the right moment, her thoughts spiraling like a storm she couldn't quiet. Now, the words tumbled out before she could stop them. Did you know? Her voice was sharp, cutting through the silence like a blade. Her mother's eyes darted to her father, who shifted uncomfortably in his chair. What are you talking about, Aisha? Her mother asked, her tone cautious. Don't play dumb, Aisha snapped, her fists clenched against the table. Did you know about them? About what they did? Her father straightened, his expression hardening. Who? What are you saying? The teachers, Aisha hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Ellis, Porter, Hensley, Ryan. Did you know they were monsters? Her mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while her father's face turned an unsettling shade of red. Aisha, stop, he said firmly, his voice low but tense. Don't you dare tell me to stop, she shot back, her voice rising. I trusted them. You trusted them. And they. Her voice cracked and she looked away, biting her lip to keep the tears at bay. We didn't know, her mother whispered, her voice shaking. Aisha, I swear we didn't know. But you should have, Aisha said, her voice cold now, a sharp contrast to her earlier outburst. You should have protected me. Her father opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. His silence was deafening. Aisha pushed back her chair abruptly, the legs scraping against the floor. Forget it, she muttered, grabbing her phone and heading for her room. You're just as blind as I was. She locked the door behind her, her breathing heavy as she sank onto the bed. The walls felt like they were closing in, suffocating her with the weight of betrayal, not just from the teachers, but from the people who were supposed to have her back. She opened her phone, scrolling aimlessly at first, but then her fingers slowed as a headline caught her eye. The dark side of authority, how corruption thrives in trusted institutions. She clicked the link, and one article turned into 2, then 10. Hours passed as she dove deeper into forums and message boards, each story of injustice and abuse fueling the fire inside her. Her fingers paused over one particular post. The title was simple but commanding. If you want justice, you have to take it. She clicked it, her heart pounding. The words on the screen seemed to speak directly to her. Justice doesn't come to those who wait. It's earned, taken, fought for. If you've been wronged, don't expect anyone else to fix it. The power is in your hands. But remember, once you start, there's no going back. Aisha stared at the screen, the weight of those words settling over her like a cloak. Her mind raced with possibilities, with plans. She wasn't sure what justice would look like yet, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to wait for someone else to deliver it. She set her phone down, her resolve hardening like steel. They had taken her innocence, her trust, but they wouldn't take her voice. Not anymore. The school looked the same, but nothing felt normal anymore. The hallways buzzed with laughter and chatter, but to Aisha, it all sounded hollow, an echo of the truth no one dared to speak. She walked through the corridors with a sense of unease, her eyes scanning every corner, every face. The teachers she had once looked up to now seemed like shadows of their former selves. She watched them closely, every glance, every interaction, and it was all there, hidden in plain sight. Mr. Ellis, the charming English teacher, stood by the lockers, his voice low as he spoke to a girl from the junior class. His hand rested on the edge of the locker, too close for comfort. Aisha's stomach churned as she remembered how he used to linger during after-school events, always finding reasons to stay just a little longer. In the teacher's lounge, she caught a glimpse of Mrs. Hensley whispering urgently to Coach Ryan. Their body language screamed secrecy, leaning in close, their eyes darting around the room as if afraid of being overheard. She had never noticed these things before. Never thought to question the way Mr. Porter always seemed to single out certain students for extra help after hours, or how Coach Ryan's encouragement often felt more like veiled manipulation. But now, every interaction seemed steeped in something dark, something sinister. Her days became a blur of observation and suspicion. Each class was a test of her patience, every passing period a chance to gather more pieces of the puzzle. The world around her seemed oblivious to the undercurrent of wrongness that pulsed through the school, but Aisha saw it everywhere. One day, as she lingered near the maintenance closet, pretending to scroll through her phone, a voice startled her. "You're wasting your time, you know." She turned sharply to see the custodian, an older man with tired eyes and a worn uniform. He leaned on his mop, studying her with a look that was equal parts curiosity and caution. "What do you mean?" Aisha asked, her voice steady despite the rapid thudding of her heart. He sighed, shaking his head. "You think you're the first to notice? The first to ask questions?" Her pulse quickened. "What do you know?" He glanced around the empty hallway before lowering his voice. "Enough to know that digging too deep is dangerous. These people, they have a way of protecting themselves." "Protecting themselves from what?" Aisha pressed. He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the cameras in the corner of the hallway. "I've said too much already. Be careful, kid." And with that, he turned back to his work, leaving Aisha more determined than ever. Later that afternoon, as she opened her locker, a slip of paper fluttered to the ground. She bent down, her fingers trembling as she picked it up. The note was written in rushed, uneven handwriting. "You're not alone in this." Her heart raced as she stared at the words. Someone knew. Someone was watching. For the first time in weeks, Aisha felt something stir within her, a glimmer of hope mixed with the burning need for answers. Whoever had left that note had just become her first ally, whether they liked it or not. Revenge is an art, and Aisha was ready to paint the masterpiece. Every stroke would be precise, every detail intentional, and the finished piece, a reckoning. In the solitude of her room, Aisha's desk had transformed into a war table. The surface was covered with a mosaic of sticky notes, printouts, and hastily scribbled notes. Strings of red yarn connected names, dates, and locations on a makeshift corkboard that hung crookedly on the wall. She had spent hours trailing her teachers, watching their every move. Mr. Ellis parked his car in the same spot every morning, lingering in his vehicle for exactly 5 minutes before entering the building. Coach Ryan always stopped at the vending machine by the gym at 2:15, the same time the hallway was mostly deserted. Mrs. Hensley had a peculiar habit of double-checking her classroom door lock at the end of the day, but never noticing the custodian watching her from the end of the hallway. Each detail was catalogued and mapped with military precision. It wasn't just their routines she was tracking, it was their vulnerabilities. Aisha wasn't just gathering information, she was building a case, one thread at a time. But it wasn't enough, she needed proof, real proof. One afternoon, during a free period, Aisha slipped into the school archives, a dimly lit room that smelled of dust and forgotten secrets. The custodian's master key, borrowed during his brief coffee break, gave her access. The filing cabinets groaned as she pulled them open, one by one, flipping through ancient records and yellowed papers. At first it seemed like a dead end, but then, tucked behind a stack of old attendance reports, she found them. Files. Confidential files. Her breath caught as she skimmed the documents. Complaints from students, suspicious transfers, and vague, dismissive responses from administration. It was all there, their crimes hidden in bureaucratic language, buried under years of apathy. But one file stood out. It was about Mrs. Hensley. Unlike the others, her record was spotless, almost suspiciously so. The kindness she showed to students, the gentle way she spoke. Aisha hesitated, doubt creeping in. Could she have been wrong about her? The uncertainty lingered, gnawing at her resolve. But there was no time for second-guessing. That evening she waited by the custodian's closet, the note still fresh in her memory. "You're not alone in this." She needed answers, and he had them. When he finally appeared, his weary eyes widened in recognition. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, glancing over his shoulder. "I found the files," Aisha said, stepping forward. "I know what they did." He sighed deeply, rubbing a hand over his face. "You think that's the whole story? What else is there?" Her voice was sharp, demanding. He hesitated, then leaned closer. "If you go through with this, they'll come after you. They always do." Her pulse quickened. "Who's they?" "The people who protect them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's bigger than you think, Aisha, and once you start this, there's no stopping it. Be sure you're ready for that." His words sent a chill down her spine, but they also solidified her resolve. She didn't care how big it was, she had already come too far to turn back. As she watched him disappear down the hallway, her mind raced. The game had changed, the stakes were higher, but Aisha wasn't afraid. Not anymore. To bring them down, Aisha had to risk everything, including herself. Justice wasn't a safe road, it was a battlefield, and she was ready to charge in. In the quiet of her room, Aisha crafted her next move with the precision of a chess master. The documents she had unearthed weren't just pieces of paper, they were weapons. She scanned and uploaded the incriminating evidence about Mr. Ellis onto a secure, anonymous platform. A single email, sent from a burner account, was dispatched to the local news outlet and a handful of whistleblower forums. The subject line read, "The Untouchable Teacher." The attachments spoke louder than words. Official complaints, eerie patterns of misconduct, and a clear paper trail of cover-ups. She knew what this meant. She knew what it could unleash. The next day, the school buzzed with tension, whispers crackling through the hallways like wildfire. A teacher had been exposed. Mr. Ellis, the same man who had once been praised for his eloquence and charm, now found himself the subject of sidelong glances and hushed conversations. Aisha watched it all unfold from her usual spot near the lockers, her face a mask of calm while her mind raced. The tension was palpable. Students exchanged knowing looks, some emboldened to share their own unease about him, others fearful of what might come next. But it wasn't just the students who were affected. The teachers had noticed too. In the staff lounge, the cracks in their unity began to show. Coach Ryan avoided eye contact with anyone, his usually booming voice reduced to clipped sentences. Mrs. Hensley, however, did something Aisha hadn't anticipated. She defended Mr. Ellis. "He's a good man," Mrs. Hensley said in the faculty meeting that Aisha overheard while sneaking past. "I've worked with him for years. We don't know the whole story." Aisha's stomach churned. Was Mrs. Hensley genuinely oblivious, or was she complicit in ways the files hadn't revealed? Doubt crept in again, threatening to derail her focus, but there was no time to second-guess herself. Later that afternoon, as Aisha opened her locker, her phone buzzed. She pulled it out, her breath hitching when she saw the message. It was from an unknown number. "They know what you're doing. Stop now." Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. Who sent it? The custodian's warning echoed in her mind. "They'll come after you." Aisha slipped the phone into her pocket, her mind racing. They might know, but it didn't matter. She had already set the first domino in motion, and she wouldn't stop until the whole structure came crashing down. She walked away from the locker, her resolve unshaken. If they thought a warning would scare her, they had no idea who they were dealing with. Justice isn't neat. It's messy, chaotic, and unforgiving. Aisha was learning this the hard way. The cafeteria buzzed with an intensity she'd never felt before, the air thick with whispers and stifled gasps. Overnight, the headline had taken on a life of its own. Beloved teacher exposed, decades of misconduct uncovered. The article didn't just share details, it painted a damning portrait. The accusations against Mr. Ellis were no longer rumours, they were now public knowledge. Outside the school, news vans clogged the narrow street, their logos and satellite dishes creating a surreal spectacle against the grim grey sky. Inside, Aisha spotted him. Mr. Ellis, the man who once commanded respect with his mere presence, now sat slumped at his desk during lunch, his head in his hands. The confidence, the charisma, gone. He looked like a man fraying at the edges. And then it happened. The principal entered the cafeteria, her expression grave, her voice steely, but tinged with discomfort. "Mr. Ellis," she said, her tone sharp enough to cut through the chaos. "We need to talk, now." The room fell silent. All eyes were on him. He rose slowly, his movements awkward and unsteady as he gathered his belongings. His hands trembled, his face ashen. Students watched in stunned silence, their phones raised, capturing every painful moment. By the time he walked out, escorted by the principal, the whispers had grown into a cacophony of speculation. Aisha should have felt triumph, vindication. This was the moment she'd fought for, the moment the truth came to light. But as her gaze drifted to the school's entrance, she saw something that made her chest tighten. Just outside the doors, shielded from the reporters by a makeshift barrier of staff, stood Mr. Ellis's wife. She clutched the hand of a small boy. Aisha guessed he was no older than 6, while trying to turn him away from the cameras. Her face was streaked with tears, her shoulders stiff with tension as though bracing for the next blow. Aisha's throat tightened, guilt weaving itself into her resolve. This wasn't about his family. They hadn't done anything wrong, but they were collateral damage now, caught in the fallout of a war they didn't start. Her thoughts spiraled as she wandered the hallway, trying to steady her breath. She'd known this would be messy, but had she underestimated how far the ripple effects would spread? For a moment, doubt threatened to overpower her resolve. Then she saw it, her locker. The door was slightly ajar, a detail so minor that most wouldn't have noticed. But Aisha never left her locker open. Cautiously she approached, her heart thudding in her chest. She opened it fully, and there it was, an envelope, stark white and unmarked, perched neatly on top of her books. Her fingers trembled as she opened it and pulled out the single sheet of paper inside. The words were typed, cold and concise. "We know it was you." Her stomach dropped. Before she could fully process the message, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her breath catching as she read the text from an unknown number. "Check your backpack." Every instinct screamed at her to leave it alone, but her curiosity outweighed her fear. Slowly she unzipped her bag. Her blood ran cold when she saw it, a USB drive, small and unassuming, nestled beneath her notebooks. She hadn't put it there. Her mind raced as she pieced it together. Someone was planting evidence against her. Evidence she didn't create, didn't recognize. The custodian's warning echoed again in her mind. "They'll come after you." This wasn't just a warning anymore, it was a threat. Aisha shoved the USB drive back into her bag, her pulse hammering in her ears. They wanted her scared, silenced. But instead of fear, something else surged through her, a fire, burning hotter than ever. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The closer you get to the truth, the more dangerous it becomes. Aisha was discovering that truth isn't just hidden, it's protected by people who will do anything to keep it buried. The school had transformed overnight. The hallways, once vibrant with the noise of students and teachers alike, now felt suffocating, each step heavy with the unspoken tension that permeated every corner. Fear had taken root, and suspicion hung in the air like a thick fog. The remaining teachers had closed ranks, creating an impenetrable wall of silence. They had become a unified force, lawyered up and holding private meetings behind closed doors. Their silence spoke volumes, an unmistakable message that anyone daring to challenge them would face dire consequences. Aisha felt it. She felt the weight of their eyes, the unspoken threats carried in every glance, every whisper. The bravest of voices had been silenced, suffocated by the looming threat of retaliation. Her phone had become a constant source of anxiety, buzzing relentlessly with anonymous messages. "You're being watched. Stay quiet, or you'll regret it." Each message made her stomach churn, her mind racing with fear and suspicion. Every noise, every shadow felt like a warning. Her paranoia spiraled, and she couldn't shake the feeling that at any moment, someone might step forward, someone who had been waiting for her to slip up. But Aisha wasn't one to back down. She refused to let fear dictate her actions. She kept digging, her anger and determination pushing her forward, urging her to expose the truth, no matter the cost. Then, one evening, as she scrolled through a whistleblower forum, a private message appeared, cryptic and unsettling. The sender's username meant nothing to her, but the content struck her like a bolt of lightning. "I know what you're trying to do. Meet me, tonight, by the old gym." Aisha's instincts screamed for her to stay away. It was a trap. But her curiosity, her drive to uncover the truth, overpowered the voice of caution. She decided to go. The old gym loomed in the distance, its dark silhouette barely visible under the cloak of night. The cold air stung her face, and the shadows seemed to writhe around her as if alive. She clutched her phone tightly, every step echoing in the silence. Then a voice broke through the stillness. "You're brave." Aisha froze. She spun around, heart pounding in her chest, and saw a figure step out from the darkness. A young woman, her face a mixture of exhaustion and defiance. Something about her was familiar yet strange, as though Aisha had seen her before but couldn't quite place where. "Who are you?" Aisha demanded. The woman smirked, her eyes hard but weary. "Someone who knows exactly what those teachers are capable of." Aisha studied her carefully, recognition slowly dawning. The pieces clicked together. She remembered seeing her face in an old yearbook, one of the students who had disappeared years ago. Her departure had been brushed aside with vague explanations, but Aisha never bought it. "You were one of them," Aisha said, her voice softer now, tinged with realization. The woman nodded grimly. "They ruined my life. I tried to speak out once, but no one listened. They made sure of that." Aisha's grip on her phone tightened, her mind racing. "Why are you here now?" The woman's eyes darkened, filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Because I don't want you to go through what I did." She pulled something from her jacket pocket and handed it to Aisha, small, unassuming, but heavy with meaning. "Here," she said. "This has everything you missed. Emails, photos, records they thought they deleted. It's enough to destroy them, but it's also enough to destroy you if you're not careful." Aisha's breath caught in her throat as she took the flash drive. "Why give this to me?" she whispered. The woman's expression hardened. "Because if you expose this, it's all on you. I can't afford to fight them again. But you're still standing. Just be sure you know what you're doing." With that, the woman turned and vanished into the night, leaving Aisha standing alone, the weight of the flash drive heavy in her palm. As Aisha walked home, her thoughts whirled. This was the evidence she had been looking for, the final piece that could bring everything to light. But the woman's warning lingered in her mind like a dark cloud. If you expose this, it's all on you. The risks were clear. Exposing the truth could tear apart everything Aisha had worked for, but she couldn't turn back now. The truth was within her grasp, and no matter what it cost her, she was ready to face whatever came next. The truth doesn't set you free, it makes you a target. Aisha knew this, but she hit send anyway. She had made her choice. The email, a digital bomb loaded with everything. The damning files, the photos, the hidden records was sent out to every major news outlet, advocacy group and law enforcement contact she could find. This was the moment she had been building toward. The evidence was irrefutable, the final piece that would bring down the walls of silence and complicity that had protected the teachers for years. By morning, the school was transformed. The once familiar place now felt alien, under siege. Reporters crowded the gates, cameras flashing, eager to capture the unfolding scandal. The air was thick with anger and fear. Parents shouted demands for answers, their voices a chorus of betrayal and outrage. Police cars lined the parking lot, their blue lights flashing against the dull, overcast sky, casting a cold glow over the scene. Inside, chaos reigned. The halls buzzed with whispers, phones pinged with breaking news alerts, and the tension was palpable. Students exchanged frantic glances, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. The teachers, every last one of them, were implicated. Their names, their faces, their actions, all exposed. The stories they had kept buried were no longer safe. Aisha moved through the crowd, her hood pulled low, trying to stay unnoticed. She didn't want recognition, not yet. Not until she was ready to face the consequences. As she passed by the classroom, she saw Mrs. Hensley standing at the front of the room, speaking to a group of parents. The woman was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she spoke. "I didn't know," Mrs. Hensley said, her voice faltering. I was pressured. I had no choice." Aisha froze. The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Mrs. Hensley wasn't just another teacher in the cover-up. She was a victim too. A bystander caught in the web of fear and manipulation, forced into silence, forced to play her part in the charade. Aisha had never seen it that way before. The files she had uncovered didn't show that. They painted the teachers as complicit, but not all of them had chosen their roles willingly. The revelation left Aisha reeling. Could she have spared Mrs. Hensley? Should she have taken the time to understand her side? Could there have been another way? But before she could dwell on the thoughts, the intercom crackled, breaking her train of thought. "Aisha Adams, please report to the principal's office immediately." Her heart skipped a beat. They know. With each step toward the principal's office, Aisha felt the weight of the school's gaze upon her. She could feel the suspicion in the air, the whispers trailing behind her as she walked through the hallways. But her legs were steady. She couldn't afford to show fear now. When she entered the principal's office, the atmosphere was thick with tension. The principal sat behind her desk, her face a mask of unreadable calm. Flanking her were two men in suits, official, sharp, and intimidating. On the desk, gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, was the flash drive. "We need to talk," the principal said, her voice cold, calculating. Aisha's pulse raced in her ears, but she stood tall, meeting their gazes without flinching. She had known this moment would come. It had been inevitable once the truth was out. The truth was no longer a secret, but its repercussions were only beginning to unfold. The teachers were exposed, but the danger had shifted. Aisha wasn't just fighting for justice anymore, she was fighting for her survival. She had taken the first step, but the road ahead was only going to get more perilous. And she had no choice but to keep moving forward. The price of justice is always higher than you expect. Aisha knew that now, standing before a room of faces ready to decide her future. The silence in the room was suffocating, punctuated only by the soft scratching of pens as the school board members scribbled notes. Aisha stood at the center, exposed under the relentless scrutiny of their gazes. Behind them, reporters filled the back row, their eyes glued to her, cameras trained on every twitch, every gesture. The media frenzy outside had followed her into this sterile, intimidating space. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, thick and undeniable. "Aisha Adams," the chairwoman began, her voice crisp and official, "do you understand the severity of the accusations against you?" Aisha's chest tightened, but she took a steadying breath. Her voice emerged clear and unwavering. "I do." The chairwoman's fingers hovered over her glasses, adjusting them with a calculated, practiced motion. "You've been linked to the recent leaks that have caused irreparable damage to this institution's reputation. Do you deny your involvement?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, every eye in the room trained on her. For a moment, Aisha considered her response, but there was no hesitation in her reply. "No, I don't deny it. I leaked the files." A hushed murmur rippled through the room, and the sound of pens against paper grew louder as the reporters hastily documented her admission. The board members exchanged sharp glances, processing her words. "And why?" the chairwoman pressed, her voice turning even more rigid. "Did you feel justified in taking such reckless action?" Aisha lifted her chin, meeting each of their gazes in turn, her voice growing more impassioned. "Because someone had to. Those teachers used their positions of power to hurt students, and no one stopped them. Complaints were ignored, records were buried, and lives were destroyed. If I hadn't acted, they would still be here, smiling in the hallways like nothing ever happened. Justice isn't reckless, it's necessary." The words hung in the air, heavy with the truth, and for a moment, the room was silent. The weight of her conviction seemed to settle over everyone, and Aisha felt the tension stretch between them. A faint cough broke the silence. The custodian, of all people, stepped forward, his usual slouched posture replaced by an unexpected strength. Aisha glanced at him, surprised by his sudden appearance. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice calm but filled with emotion. The chairwoman hesitated before giving a curt nod. "Proceed." The custodian's gaze met Aisha's, and for a moment she saw something unspoken pass between them. "I've worked at this school for 20 years, he began, his voice steady, but his words heavy. "I've seen things I wish I hadn't, things I regret not speaking out about. But when you're on the bottom rung, you're told to keep your head down and stay out of it. Aisha didn't have to do this, but she did. She risked everything to do what people like me should have done a long time ago. She's not the villain here." The board members exchanged uneasy glances, and one of them leaned forward, their expression hardening. "Are you admitting to complicity in this situation?" The custodian nodded, unflinching. "Yes, and if you're going to punish her, you should punish me too. I gave her the keys to the archives. I showed her where to look." A ripple of shock spread across the room. Aisha's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. The custodian, her unexpected ally, had just exposed himself as a willing participant in the very system she had sought to dismantle. The stakes had just risen higher. The chairwoman cleared her throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "We will take your testimony into account." The room was thick with tension as the hearing dragged on. The reporters worked to frame their narratives, some casting Aisha as a hero, others as a reckless troublemaker. Outside, protesters gathered, shouting in support, demanding her expulsion, fueling the chaos that had engulfed the school. Finally, the chairwoman called for order. "The board will deliberate and deliver its verdict at a later date. Until then, Miss Adams, you are suspended from all school activities." Aisha nodded, though the words hit her harder than she let on. She had known this was coming, but the uncertainty of the decision, the waiting, was its own kind of punishment. As she left the room, cameras flashed and questions were thrown at her from every direction. But Aisha kept her head high, her steps measured. This was far from over. She wasn't backing down, not now, not when the truth had finally come to light. For now, though, she was in limbo, caught between what she had done and what lay ahead. And that waiting, that uncertainty, was a punishment she hadn't anticipated. But it was nothing compared to the cost of justice. She would pay it, because there was no other choice. Aisha's journey was far from over, but as she stood there, feeling the unity of the crowd around her, she knew one thing for certain. This fight had become something bigger than just her. It was a movement, a collective cry for justice, a call for those who had been silenced to finally speak, for those who had suffered to finally be heard. As the rally continued into the afternoon, Aisha found herself surrounded by people who had become allies in this fight. They exchanged stories, shared their experiences, and made plans for the future. What had started as a single act of defiance had evolved into a network of voices, bound together by a common goal. The days ahead would bring more challenges, more battles to fight. But Aisha had found something in herself she hadn't known was there, a strength she could tap into when the world seemed determined to break her. Her fight wasn't over. It was only just beginning. And as she looked to the future, she realized that this wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about changing the system, about giving power to those who had been overlooked for far too long. With her parents' support, Mrs. Hensley by her side, and the movement behind her, Aisha felt ready to take on whatever came next. Justice, after all, came at a price, but it was one worth paying. And even if she was just a single voice, she knew she wasn't alone in this fight anymore.
Hey, before you go, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Join our amazing community and stay connected with fresh content every single day. It's free, it's easy, and it guarantees you'll never miss out on the stories, insights, and adventures we share. So go ahead, click subscribe, and let's make every day unforgettable together.